Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I build a Seamaster Homage by rubbing solvent on the back of a dial with a Q-tip, pulling up the hour markers of the dial with some floss, and activating the lume with a UV light. A little bit of a different intro this time around. As it turns out, I either did not film or I lost the footage of the watch in natural sunlight. Regardless, we press on. You'll see I'm taking away the bracelet here, followed by our Seamaster style case, followed by the black ceramic bezel insert, then the black date wheel, a decorative rotor, and a decorative bridge, handset number 1, and handset number 2, dial number 1, and dial number 2. And last but not least, the NH35 movement. I'm going to start this build off a little differently than usual. Typically, I'll begin these builds by modifying and regulating the movement. However, this time I'm starting off with the dial because I wanted to do a little bit of an experiment. You saw in the intro of this video, I had two different dials. On the genuine Omega Seamaster, the hour markers are lumed with blue superluminova all the way around. The hour and seconds hands are also lumed with blue superluminova, but the minute hand is lumed in green. This is done so that the hands can easily be distinguished in the dark, especially while diving. Also, on the genuine black Seamaster, only the bezel pip is lumed with green superluminova. That said, I was able to find a black bezel that had the pip lumed in green, while the numbers and markers were lumed in blue. This bicolor bezel insert would be more akin to the no time to die version of this watch, but more lume is never a bad thing, and it fits the overall lume aesthetic we were after on this watch. So the question remains, why the need for two dials? Kai, the individual who commissioned this build, had some requirements for the dial. He wanted to maintain the overall look of the Omega Seamaster dial with the signature wave pattern, date window at 6 o'clock, blue superluminova, and a custom logo. The issue I soon found was that no dial manufacturer was able to produce a dial that fit all the criteria. Some would offer the custom logo, but wouldn't have the date at 6 o'clock. Others would have the date at 6, but were not equipped to make the custom logo. I also found only one dial that was lumed with BGW9 superluminova. I soon figured out that the only way that I was going to create his desired dial was to combine at least two together. I discussed this with Kai, and he agreed. It was going to be a bit of a gamble, and something I hadn't done before, but I was up for a bit of a challenge. The dial on screen now is the dial lumed with BGW9. You'll see it does not feature a date window. What I was just doing was using a solvent-soaked Q-tip to gently remove the adhesive that was used to hold the hour markers in place. I decided to try it on this dial first, as it's the donor dial, and it's okay to mess it up just in case I get a little reckless. The solvent helps break down the glue, or at least remove some of its adhesive properties, causing it to gum up. From there, I can just use tweezers or a pin to pop the marker out and remove it. The process is simple, but a little time consuming, as I wanted to make sure no mistakes were made and all 13 markers came out nice and clean. Here you'll see I've already popped the markers out, and now just using some plastic tweezers, I'm going to fully remove them. While the circular markers came out relatively easy, these rectangular ones put up a little bit of a fight. The circular markers are held in position with just one post, while these rectangular ones are held in position by two smaller posts. I wasn't really finding success with the plastic tweezers, as I couldn't really get a good enough grip on them to pull them out. I'm not entirely sure how I got the idea to use dental floss, but it ended up working. I was able to get the floss flush to the dial, and a few strands would manage to make their way under the marker. Once there, I could gently pull on them, and it would pull the marker out. And as a little bonus, the air was filled with a slight minty smell. Perhaps a bit of an unusual technique, but in this case it all worked out. I'm sure there's a tool for this exact thing, as there seems to be a tool for every task in watchmaking. When you think about it, it makes sense. The process of making and maintaining watches has been around for hundreds of years. Any problem that could have occurred has probably already occurred. Off camera, I used the same removal process on this custom dial. And now it's on to the moment of truth. Will the donor markers fit into the holes on the custom dial? By a small miracle, they do. I honestly didn't know what my next step would have been if they didn't fit. Now comes the task of securing the hour markers to the dial. For this, I'm using UV glue and a UV light. My approach is to place each marker into its designated slot, then use a micro Q-tip dipped in UV glue to apply a small amount to the back of the dial. By gently pushing upward, I aim to encourage a small amount of the glue to seep through the hole and around the marker's post, ensuring a secure bond. Once in place, I cure the glue with the UV light, which sets within seconds. I've chosen to apply the glue only from the back of the dial to prevent any seepage. Adding adhesive directly to the marker before placement runs the risk of excessive glue being pressed outward, potentially marring the dial surface. With the first few markers now securely in place, all that's left to do is to continue the process all the way around the dial. Now that we have talked about the hour markers and the lume of this watch, it's time to talk about the logo on the dial. Kai and I have over 100 emails back and forth discussing this build, and the majority of them are in relation to the dial. Originally, Kai just wanted Seiko displayed on the dial, but as we continued to discuss the build, he felt that may be too simplistic and wanted to add a few more details. Wanting to create a parody dial, similar to the relaxed style dials I love so much, I sent Kai a draft that looks similar to the Seamaster dial, however it read Seiko, Seamaster, unprofessional. Kai wasn't a huge fan of this and instead had some ideas for a much more personalized logo, leading us to what we have here. The symbol at the top of the dial is the Japanese symbol for the ocean. Obviously, the Seamaster has close ties to everything nautical. Next is the Seiko logo, and let's talk a little bit about this. Using Seiko branding on a dial can be a controversial topic. I'm a big proponent of custom or parody logos as well as sterile dials. That said, the choice ultimately comes down to the individual commissioning the build. When I presented these options to Kai, he had this to say, quote, "Without the logo, the piece doesn't flow correctly with my intended vision. I'm sure I could find a similar name or word, but personally, I would find it distasteful. I wasn't really looking to assemble a gag timepiece, but instead a personalized piece of art paying tribute to a brand I enjoy." Close quote. Below the logo is the word Seigaha, which translates to sea or waves. Again, please don't come for me for my pronunciation. The Seigaha pattern is one of the most prominent elements of Japanese culture. It is represented as a group of concentric circles drawn in the form of waves moving outward. Kai felt that this pattern and the pattern of the Omega wave dial were very closely tied together. Then, below that, the Japanese characters Umi no Sencho translates to Captain of the Sea. Kai even corresponded with the pen pal to ensure the wording and translation were correct. We went through many drafts before finally landing on this layout, and I have to say, it came out great. One thing I did not anticipate was the dial coming in slightly too big for the case. This case accepts 31mm dials, and I believe I ordered a 31.8mm dial. 0.8mm doesn't seem like much, and I thought there might be some wiggle room within the case, but I was wrong. With me already MacGyvering one aspect of the dial, why not do it again? I ended up making a poor man's watchmaker lathe using my Dremel and a vise. I secured the Dremel in the jaws of the vise, and then using a padded tip held the dial in place. The setup resembled a cutting wheel, with the dial acting as the wheel. I revved up the Dremel, and then ever so gently held a diamond tip file at an angle to the edge of the dial to remove material. I checked every few seconds to see if enough material had been removed, and after a few passes, the dial fit like a glove. Skipping ahead here onto the last hour marker, you'll see I used plastic tweezers the entire time during this step of the process. This is to minimize the risk of scratching the dial and or the hour marker itself. I would have liked to use Rotor, however once the hour marker was adhered to it, it had a hard time releasing into its spot on the dial. On another note, be sure to wear protective eyewear when working with UV light. Many years ago, I actually suffered from artificial keratitis after being exposed to a UV light for an extended period of time. But of course, I did not learn my lesson and did not wear protective eyewear while working on this build, and paid the price later on. I tried to show off the glow of the BGW9 in this video, however under the bright lights in camera, it's barely visible, though you can see a pale baby blue color in the markers after they've been hit with the UV light. I decided to hit all of the UV resin with one more pass of the UV light just to make sure that everything had been cured and all the markers were secured in place before moving on to the next step. Now moving on to the movement of the watch. With this case having an exhibition case back, I think it's important to improve the look of the movement. The NH35 is a great movement, but it isn't going to be winning any beauty pageants. Luckily, there are a few options that help the overall look of these movements for the wearer's viewing pleasure. In this case, I'm going to be replacing the stock rotor and the automatic winding bridge with some decorated options. You'll see I just removed the stock automatic winding rotor by unscrewing a single screw and then removing the rotor with a pair of tweezers. Next is the automatic works bridge. Now, in a previous video, I misspoke and called this the train wheel bridge. I would like to thank the commenter who pointed that out, as obviously I want to use the right vernacular for those watching these videos. This bridge is removed by unscrewing 2 screws. Once those are unscrewed and removed, the bridge is free to come out. Sometimes these put up a bit of a fight, but this one decided to come out nice and easy. Now for the decorative bridge. I was interested in replicating the finish in the genuine Omega Seamaster. I had to do some research to figure out what the finish was called, and it looks like it's known as Cotes de Geneve and Arabesque. This form of Cotes de Geneve has a spiral pattern similar to the blades of a turbine. Also in my research, I found that Arabesque is one of the quintessential ballet poses where the dancer is on one foot with the other foot behind them. The more you know. You can see that I've placed the bridge down and I've got it lined up correctly. All that's left to do is to screw it in place. The bridge manufacturer includes 2 blued screws with each bridge. Though it's a small detail, it's a very nice detail, and I hope to use more blued screws going forward. With the decorated bridge now in place, I can look at getting the decorated rotor installed. Originally, Kai shared an image where the rotor had a bunch of Seiko branding on it and asked if I could add that to the build. I explained that the watch in the image simply had a sticker placed over the stock rotor, and that a much better option would be to completely replace the stock rotor with a decorated aftermarket one. Upon realizing this was the case, Kai agreed that a complete replacement was a better option, though he still wanted branding on the rotor. I was able to assure him a clean rotor with the Arabesque finish would be beautiful, especially when the light hit it just right. To install the rotor, I needed to place it over the threaded post in the middle of the movement, and then screw it down tightly, making sure that it's level so that it doesn't make any contact with any part of the movement. I haven't shown this step in the build process over the last few videos, as it's relatively the same for each watch. For those who don't know, this is a Timegrapher, a device that listens to the movement and displays its accuracy. Across 5 different positions, this movement was running an average of 1.5 seconds slow per day at 232.4 degrees of amplitude and with a beat error of 0.04 milliseconds, which is very good. Now that I've finished making all necessary modifications to the back of the movement and I've checked it for accuracy, I'm going to flip the movement around because it's time to change out the date wheel. Kai was very specific about having the date window positioned at 6 o'clock. Additionally, he wanted the date wheel to be black to match the color of the dial. This meant that swapping out the original date wheel was necessary to achieve his vision. To do this modification, I began by unscrewing the 4 tiny screws that secure the date indicator maintaining plate in position. These screws hold the plate in place, ensuring that the date mechanism functions properly. Once these screws are removed, the plate can be carefully taken off, exposing the date wheel beneath it. And for all those aspiring watchmakers, builders, and modders, go out and get yourself a little tray to hold all the miscellaneous parts, pieces, and screws when you're taking apart a movement. Because crawling around on your hands and knees with a flashlight looking for a screw you dropped on the floor isn't as fun as it sounds. With the last of the 4 screws now removed, I can very gently grab the date indicator maintaining plate with a pair of tweezers and remove it from the movement. At this stage, I needed to be especially cautious while removing the date wheel, making sure to keep the date jumper plate seated as I relieve the tension stored in the date jumper arm. If the jumper plate were to shift out of position, it could cause the gears in the date corrector mechanism to move out of alignment. In that case, they would need to be repositioned correctly before reassembling the mechanism. You'll see I used one of my larger screwdrivers to hold the date jumper plate down as I removed the white date disc. Fortunately, for this instance, all of the plates and gears remained in their necessary positions, making for a smooth transition. With the old date wheel now removed, I can place the black 6 o'clock date wheel into position. Once that's all lined up, I'm going to hold down the date jumper plate with that big screwdriver again, and then pull back on the date jumper arm until it falls into one of the notches on the date wheel. It's important to mention that at this stage, there's still nothing holding the date wheel into position, and it's only there if it wants to be. Once that date jumper arm is set into one of the notches, I can place the date indicator maintaining plate back into the movement. To secure everything in place, I reinsert the 4 screws, tightening them about 80% of the way first. This step ensures that these screws can be inserted easily without creating tension in the plate. And once I confirm that everything has been properly aligned and is functioning as intended, I can fully tighten everything down. While I get all these screws screwed back in, I want to give a big thank you to Kai for the opportunity to build this highly modified watch. I'm always up for a bit of a challenge, and it's even better when I can showcase a new design or style for those watching. Speaking of, I want to give a big thank you to those tuning into these videos. We just crossed over a major milestone, hitting 1,000 subscribers. So again, thank you to those watching, liking, and subscribing to the channel. I have plenty of videos lined up and some other new things coming this year. If you're interested, feel free to follow me on Instagram at Golden State Watch Shop. And if you, or somebody you know, might be interested in a custom watch, please reach out to me over on Instagram or via email at garrett@goldenstatewatchshop.com, and I'd be happy to discuss the build in more detail with you. What I often like to do is hold down the date indicator maintaining plate with a pair of tweezers and then manipulate the date function of the watch. This can help the gears of this mechanism synchronize and mesh, and it also ensures that everything is sitting flush and flat and shows if the mechanism is working correctly. As you saw, with a little bit of pressure on the plate, I was able to use the quick date change function to manipulate the date, so now I'm free to start installing all the screws. Getting the screws set into place can offer a little bit of a challenge, especially if you're using some bad tweezers like I was in this video. I have since upgraded to a nice pair of Swiss Bourgeon tweezers, making it much easier to do this kind of work. It appears I've gotten all 4 screws now seated in the correct locations, and I'm just working my way around the movement, tightening them down fully. With everything now tightened down, I'm going to pull out the crown to the quick date change function and manipulate that just to make sure that that's still working as it should. Then I'll pull out the crown to its final position, set the time, and ensure that the date is flicking over at what would be midnight. And with that working as it should, I can move on to the next operation. With the movement now fully modified and the dial shaved down so that it would fit inside the case, I attach it to the movement. This dial only came with 2 dial feet, meaning there was no need to trim and file down any unnecessary feet. All I needed to do was line up the dial feet with the holes in the gray spacer and then press down gently. I also wanted to make sure that the 6 o'clock date window was lining up correctly with the 6 o'clock date wheel, which it was. And with the date mechanism working as it should, I'm going to go ahead and set the date and time to midnight, and I can move on to setting the hands. So one of the biggest, if not the main reason for doing those modifications to the dial was so that we could have the lume on the hands be different colors. As I mentioned before, on the genuine watch, the hour and seconds hands are lumed in blue superluminova, while the minute hand is lumed in green superluminova to make it easier to distinguish them in the dark. So to accomplish this, I simply bought two different hand sets. The first is lumed with BGW9, and the other is lumed with C3, giving us the blue and green offset. As for the installation, everything is the same. First the hour hand, and then the minute hand, and finally the second hand are set into place. However, as this is a new style of handset yet to be seen on the channel, maybe we can discuss the history of them. In 1957, the original Omega Seamaster was born. However, it bore a different style of hands, commonly known as broad arrow hands. In 1978, though changes were made, the Seamaster still looked quite different than the watch we know today, now bearing a new handset, resembling that of the mil-spec style. Then, in 1995, a collaboration was announced that was second only to Omega's partnership with NASA. The Seamaster became the official watch adorned by the world's most famous spy, James Bond. Now resembling the watches we see today, the Seamaster was equipped with the skeletonized James Bond hands. So with that, it looks like I've got the minute hand now placed over the post, and I'm using my hand setting tool to nudge it into position right at 12 o'clock. And now that I'm happy with its alignment, I'm going to press it into place using the red tip on my hand setting tool. Again, applying firm but gentle pressure. And just like before, I'm going to rotate the hands all the way around the dial, just to make sure that they don't come in contact with each other or any of the indices. And with the hands moving freely of any obstructions, we can also see when the date flicks over, which looks like 1 minute before midnight. Last but not least, I can set the seconds hand into place, and using again one of my favorite techniques of putting a little bit of Rotor in the end of the hand setting tool, using that to pick up the seconds hand, and then placing it over the pinion, and then gently pushing it into place. Just like that, it's on. I'm going to rotate the minute hand just a little bit so that it's directly under the seconds hand, and then push it down. Moving the minute hand lets me know how close I'm getting to it with the seconds hand to make sure that they do not come in contact with each other. Then, just to make sure that the hands are as clean as possible, I'm going to use one of these micro Q-tips to brush them and remove any sponges or debris that may have been resting on them. As much as I love Rotor, it does sometimes leave a little smudge on the hands, and this is a perfect way to remove those. Moving on to the case of this watch. Coming in with a diameter of 42 millimeters, it's large enough to offer presence on the wrist, but still be wearable for most people. The lug-to-lug distance sits around 49 millimeters, keeping the proportions in check and ensuring that the watch hugs the wrist comfortably. At just over 13 millimeters thick, it's slightly thicker than the other watches featured on this channel. The case features some prominent aspects featured on the genuine Omega as well. starting with the twisted lugs, commonly known as liar's lugs, which are synonymous with the Omega tool watches. This lug style stretches back to the 1950s and is still utilized in today's watches. Another distinct feature of the watch is what appears to be an additional crown at the 10 o'clock position. However, while this may resemble a crown, it actually represents a helium escape valve. Now for another lesson. What exactly is a helium escape valve, you may ask? It's a solution to a problem encountered in the early days of saturation diving. Saturation divers work at such extreme depths that the time required for decompression would drastically cut into the actual working time. To overcome this, they live in a pressurized chamber aboard a support ship where the internal pressure is gradually adjusted to match their working depth. To reach the dive site, they travel in a pressurized diving bell, exit to complete their task, and then return to the bell before heading back to the chamber. Once their mission is complete, the chamber is slowly depressurized to sea level conditions, allowing them to exit safely. So what's the issue with helium? The air we normally breathe consists of roughly 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen. However, at high pressures, nitrogen can cause a condition known as nitrogen narcosis, which impairs cognitive function, one of the primary limitations of deep diving on standard air. To counter this, helium is used as a substitute for nitrogen, which allows the divers to descend hundreds of feet deeper and remain underwater for longer durations. But the helium presents a unique challenge for watches. Its tiny atoms can seep past watertight gaskets and accumulate inside the case. While helium itself isn't harmful to the watch, during decompression, the trapped gas, now under extreme pressure, struggles to escape quickly enough. This pressure buildup can blow the crystal off the watch. One solution is to build an ultra-thick case capable of withstanding extreme pressure, but the result is an impractical, bulky design. Instead, many dive watches feature a one-way helium escape valve, which automatically vents excess gas during decompression, allowing the watch to maintain its structural integrity while remaining wearable for everyday consumers. With the lesson on saturation diving now out of the way, we can get back to the watch build. In the background, you saw that I cleaned the case, crystal and dial, removed the crown stem, cased up the movement, and lubricated all gaskets and O-rings. I decided to cut out the process of trimming down the crown stem to the correct size for this video. If you're curious on that operation, please take a look at any of the previous videos where the process is discussed in full detail. With the stem now inserted into the movement through the case, I can tighten the exhibition case back down. From there, I can flip the whole watch over and work on getting the bezel set in place. This process is relatively the same as all bezels you've seen me insert before. I'll start by removing this protective film, which will unveil a piece of double-sided adhesive within the bezel. Then I'll just align the bezel insert with the 12 o'clock marker. From there, I can press down and seat it into place. It's very important that I make sure the actual bezel is not in between two positions. In the case that it was between two positions and I set the bezel insert into place, it would not correctly align with the 12 o'clock marker of the dial. Now that I have everything set and pushed into place, I want to make sure that everything still works, so I'll just rotate the bezel all the way around, making sure it doesn't bind in any position. Luckily, there's no issues there, and I can move on to the final part of the build, getting the bracelet attached. The bracelet is where there was a bit of an oversight on my end. All the bracelets I have built with before have used screws to hold the links together. It didn't matter if it was a Jubilee, Oyster, Presidential, or whatever the AP style is called, they all use screws. This is the first bracelet to use pins to chain the links together, and though it's a quintessential tool and almost everybody has one, my bench, at least at this point, did not have a pin vise. This made installing the bracelet a little bit more difficult, though not impossible, as I was able to fold the bracelet over, run the spring bar through the end link, and then get it lined up within the lugs. Now, the bracelet for this build is the standard Omega Seamaster style bracelet. It's a bit hefty, as the bracelet doesn't taper down like the bracelets found on other dive watches. The clasp operates on a single swing arm and is opened using a twin trigger release. Within the clasp is a fold-out diver's extension, just in case you need to wear the watch over a wetsuit. As I finish up here, I just want to give one final thank you to Kai for the build opportunity. A lot of time was spent discussing every detail of this watch, and I really think it paid off in the end. I've been eyeing some parts for my own Seamaster build, so stay tuned for that build. As always, thank you to everybody checking out these videos. Hitting 1,000 subscribers is a huge milestone, and I can't thank you guys enough for the support. Unfortunately, I don't have any shots of the watch in natural sunlight, so here's some final shots of the watch in studio lighting. Thanks for watching.